Hi, I'm the History Guy, and today I'm proud to bring you the next episode in our series on the History Guy's hats that is exclusive for patrons on Patreon. Today I'm going to talk about a hat that is so iconic that it has come to symbolize a nation and represents a military who has served with distinction the great wars of the 20th century. Enjoy, and as always, thank you for being a patron. This is a hat that is officially called khaki fur felt, or KFF, but it's generally referred to as a slouch hat. And characteristic of slouch hats, it has a wide brim. It's pinned up on one side, this one on the left, though sometimes they are pinned up on the right. And while you would think that the slouch hat is really defined by the characteristic pinned up side, it's actually named for the other side, which slouches down, and the hat is sometimes worn unpinned and would still be called a slouch hat. This particular hat happens to be Australian, which is the army that is most associated with the slouch hat, but the history goes back farther than that. The term slouch hat is actually not clearly defined, and the slouch hat can be used to refer to almost any wide-brimmed hat, especially if it's worn at an angle. In fact, the familiar hat styles known as tricorns and bicorns, both types of cocked hat, were simply broad-brimmed hats, purportedly first used by the Spanish during the 80 Years' War. Broad-brimmed hats were simple, protected against both sun and rain. Over time, the styles changed as the sides began to be pinned up, usually to facilitate rifle drill. A bicorn is pinned on two sides, and a tricorn on three. In using that nomenclature, then a slouch hat could be called a unicorn, because it's really nothing more than a bicorn or a tricorn that's only pinned up on one side. Early examples of a cocked hat pinned on only one side were the Cavaliers of King Charles I during the English Civil War, who preferred a fancy cocked hat pinned on one side, a style that was also sometimes used by the famous French Musketeers of the Guard, so colorfully described by Alexandre Dumas. During the Napoleonic Wars, a high black hat pinned on one side was most popularized by the Austrian army. While the design was used by some line regiments, it was most commonly used by Jägers, a term which literally means hunter, but in the military which referred to light infantry, skirmishers, scouts, or riflemen. The Austrians called the hat a Korshut, and the Korshut was usually black with a high crown and a feather cockade. There was often a brass plaque with a unit designation in the front. It is unclear, however, whether the Korshut inspired the modern slouch hat. In 1852, Lajos Kossuth, a deposed leader from Hungary, visited the United States, where he was greeted with wide acclaim. Kossuth has a complex legacy, but Americans saw him as a fighter for freedom and democratic values. He had hoped to gain U.S. backing for further actions in Europe, but was ultimately unsuccessful. What he did do was tour the nation with a soft, wide-brimmed hat that became rather popular. The Kossuth hat, which was also called a slouch hat, again because of the soft, slouching brim, was commonly used by soldiers on both sides of the U.S. Civil War, although more commonly by the Confederates. The Civil War slouch hat was only rarely worn with a side pinned, however, and the term was used to refer to almost any hat that wasn't a képi, or at least any with a brim all around, even if the brim was not particularly wide. Separately, the official U.S. infantry dress hat at the beginning of the Civil War was a high-crowned, wide-brimmed black felt hat commonly called a Hardee hat, after William J. Hardee, who had been commandant of cadets at West Point. The Hardee hat was pinned on one side to allow rifle drill, on the right side for cavalry and artillery, and on the left for infantry. The hat had a wool cord whose color denoted branch of service. The Hardee hat was worn by both sides during the war, and Hardee himself served with the Confederate Army. However, the hat was considered hot and uncomfortable and not widely worn. One notable exception, however, was the Iron Brigade, comprised of soldiers raised in the western states of Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan. The Iron Brigade wore uniforms more closely resembling the dress uniform than most other Union regiments. That uniform included the Hardee hat, which by some stories was originally issued in error but adopted as it gave the brigade a unique look, and the tall crown made the soldiers look taller and more imposing. The brigade was, in fact, sometimes called the Black Hat Brigade because of the Hardee hat, although it purportedly was given its more famous name by Major General George McClellan, whom, after seeing them pushing back Confederate forces at the September 1862 Battle of South Mountain, remarked that they must be made of iron. The Iron Brigade distinguished themselves throughout the war, but particularly so at the Battle of Gettysburg. Although the Hardee hat was never apparently called a slouch hat, its design was actually much more similar to a modern slouch hat than the hats that were called slouch hats during the Civil War. The use of the slouch hat continued into the Indian Wars, where slouch hats were regulation wear for both officers and enlisted men, although the hat was only very occasionally seen worn with one side pinned up. The hat, which in the form of a Stetson cowboy hat is still often seen worn as unofficial headgear for air cavalry units, carried over into the war with Spain, where the hat was famously worn in the traditional slouch hat style, with the left brim pinned up by the commander of the United States 1st Volunteer Cavalry. But again, it's not clear whether the modern slouch hat was derived in any way from these other military designs, because in fact it's a really simple design that's very practical, especially in hot or jungle climates. And in fact the hat that is most associated with Australia today was imported from Asia. Australia got its iconic hat from an officer named Thomas Price, who was born in Tasmania and served with the British Indian Army in the 1860s. During his service with the Indian Army, he was seconded as a police superintendent in Burma, where the police used a simple wide-brim hat pinned up on one side. Some police units in India still utilize the slouch hat today. Price recognized the simple utility of a slouch hat. He retired in 1883 with the rank of lieutenant colonel and settled in the colony of Victoria in Australia. The colony had a small, semi-professional defense force that was separate from the British Army. He was given a commission in the Victorian Military Force and in 1885 raised a regiment of mounted rifles. Raised from rural areas of Victoria, the Victorian mounted rifles required recruits to bring their own horse. With the Victorian mounted rifles, Price brought the idea of light horse, quickly mobile infantry well suited for the defense of a frontier, to the military in Australia. While Victorian forces at the time generally wore a blue uniform, Price got permission to uniform the mounted rifles in khaki, a movement that was gradually being adopted throughout the empire. Included in that uniform was the slouch hat, an idea borrowed from his days in Burma and a design that would eventually come to characterize the armed forces of Australia. In December 1890, the military commanders of the then separate Australian colonies prior to the Federation of Australia agreed that all Australian forces, with the exception of the artillery, would wear the slouch hat. It was to be looped up on one side, Victoria and Tasmania on the right, and the other colonies, later states, on the left. The reason for pinning on different sides had to do with the various rifle drills used, as the pinning was generally for the purpose of slinging a rifle without knocking off the hat. In October 1889, long-standing tensions and conflicts over the control of resources and mines boiled over into the Second Boer War between the British Empire and the two Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The Boers initially had an advantage in that British troops in South Africa were largely infantry, while the Boers were natural horsemen, making the Boer commandos highly effective, light cavalry. The mobility of their cavalry, as well as their high-quality Mauser rifles and their skilled marksmanship, contributed to their initial success in the conflict. While Britain was slow to realize how many troops would be needed in the largest and deadliest of the Victorian wars, they quickly recognized the need for mobile units to counter the Boers. While many of these units were recruited from South Africa, Australia offered an obvious solution as well. The climate and terrain of Australia was similar to that of South Africa. Much like the Boers, many Australians were recruited from rural areas where they were skilled at horsemanship. And thanks to Colonel Tom Price, Australia had a regiment of highly skilled light cavalry. And also thanks to Tom Price, those regiments were largely equipped with slouch hats. Price himself served in the war, commanding the 2nd Victorian Contingent between 1900 and 1902. At the outbreak of hostilities, Britain was already calling for volunteers from Australia, including the New South Wales Lancers. The Lancers were actually in training in England when the war started and were among the first troops to arrive in South Africa. Australian units and local South African units, including Australian volunteers, were largely either light cavalry or mounted infantry. They were highly effective in the Boer War, where their bushcraft, marksmanship, and horsemanship made them an effective counter to the Boers. Australians played significant roles, both in the defeat of the Boer armies in the field and the bloody guerrilla war that followed. While the Second Boer War was the place where the distinctive slouch hat became associated with Australian forces, the style was more widely used, for example by units from New Zealand, which also fielded almost exclusively mounted rifle units in the conflict. Canadian mounted infantry, like the Canadian Mounted Rifles and the Royal Canadian Dragoons, and was common for both colonial units such as the British South Africa Police and the Bushveld Carbineers, which was recruited from him in South Africa, but was nonetheless made up of about 40% Australians. The slouch hat was also used by British units who either saw the design's utility or were issued slouch hats because there was a shortage of standard cork British pith helmets. Two British units, the Royal East Kent Mounted Rifles and the Imperial Yeomanry, retained the slouch hat for brief periods following the war, although their use had been discontinued by British units before the Great War. For their part, the Boers, who did not typically wear standard uniforms, very often wore soft, wide-brim hats, sometimes pinned on one side in the slouch hat style. By the coming of the Great War, slouch hats were a standard part of the Australian uniform for the more than 420,000 Australian troops who served. New Zealand cavalry units also used the slouch hat, although New Zealand infantry was instead issued the similar campaign hat. But Australia wasn't the only army using the slouch hat. The Imperial German Schutztruppe, or Colonial Protection Force, that protected colonies in Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, used a pith helmet, but also wore slouch hats as an alternative, as did German colonial police. Thus, the slouch hat was common in the Africa theater. The German slouch hat was pinned relatively high on the right side and was famously worn by the charismatic commander of German forces in the East Africa campaign, Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck, popularly called the Lion of Africa. In a unique piece of history, the slouch hat was favored by Irish volunteers during the 1916 Easter Rising, an armed insurrection by Irish Republicans intended to establish an independent Irish Republic. The uprising lasted 6 days, resulted in nearly 500 deaths. Although the rising itself was put down quickly, the British response and subsequent actions shifted public opinion away from Home Rule. The rising was seen as the beginning of the Irish Revolutionary period. The hat was again worn by Australian troops as well as other Allied troops in the China-Burma-India theater in the Second World War. The hat was standard issue for soldiers of the Dutch East Indies Army, and similar Terai hat or Gurkha hat, which is not worn pinned up but is worn at such an angle that the hat touches the right ear and thus is notably slouched, is traditionally worn by troops from Nepal called Gurkhas. Both the Terai hat and the more traditional slouch hat were used by the Long Range Penetration Group under General Ord Wingate in the Burma theater, popularly called the Chindits, and was also informally used by American troops in the theater such as OSS Detachment 101 and the 1st Air Commando Group. The slouch hat is still worn as a ceremonial headdress for units of the Australian Army, Air Force, and occasionally Navy, as well as for general duties for some regiments. Today the hat is worn pinned up on the left for ceremonial dress, but with the brim down for general duties. The hat has a distinctive unit color patch, a patch of colored cloth that represents a unit, on the right, and a corps or regiment badge placed on the front. The hat has a puggaree or cloth wrap. The puggaree originated in India and has the purpose of insulation. Historically, the color of the puggaree has been used to denote unit identity or branch. The current Australian slouch hat has 7 folds in the puggaree, 6 to symbolize the 6 states, and the 7th represents Australia's territories. Some Australian cavalry units still also wear an emu feather pinned with the fold. The feather harkens back to the First World War, when light horsemen would chase down an emu on horseback and pluck a feather from them, proof of exceptional horsemanship. Another unique thing about an Australian slouch hat is the unique Australian Sun Badge. That badge represents the Australian Army. It's called the General Service Badge. It harkens back to the Australian action at Anzac Cove during the First World War. It's placed on the side of the hat, so that when it's folded up, the badge will show right there. And the badge has changed over time, so by looking at the Sun Badge, you can generally tell when the hat was made. So, for example, this badge says on it, Australian Military Forces. And it doesn't say Australian Commonwealth Forces, and that means that this badge, and likely this hat, was made after 1948, when they made that change. But also you see that the badge has a crown on it. And it's important that this crown is not the Tudor crown, but this is the St. Edward crown. And that tells me that this badge was actually made after the badge was changed in 1954, because that was after Queen Elizabeth was coronated in 1952. And so that shows that this is the badge that was used between 1954 and 1969. And that fits with what I know about the hat, because there's a label inside that says Dunkerley Limited, made in Australia, size 6 7/8, and it's dated 1956. And that tells us that this particular hat came into service just a little bit too late to have been in the Korean conflict. The slouch hat has a long and storied history. It's treated with great respect in Australia and is a reminder of the distinguished history of the Australian military. Its iconic design is born of practical value, still used by various police forces, usually in tropical climates. It is still used by the U.S. military today for female drill sergeants in the Army and Air Force. No collection of military headgear would be complete without an Australian military slouch hat, and I am proud to be a steward of this historical artifact.